Zombie pigmen were constantly walking up and down the hallway, and they still knew to respect Notch, so they would part to the side whenever he walked through. Notch walked for an entire 5 minutes before finally reaching the throne room of Herobrine. Herobrine was sitting in his throne made of soul sand, waiting for Notch and Queen Enderdragon to arrive. When he saw Notch enter the room, he stepped down from his throne and extended his arms. "Ah, Notch. It's good to see you again. I hope the Queen isn't late. I'd really like to get started on this meeting." After embracing Herobrine for a moment, Notch sat down in a comfy armchair near the fireplace. Notch wondered why Herobrine had put a fireplace in the nether when it was already over 250 degrees all the time. Herobrine sat down in his throne fashioned from soul sand. He then snapped his fingers, and a medium-sized magma cube hopped up under his feet, which he used as a footrest. Herobrine pulled out a ball of magma cream and slicked back his hair with it, which made his head smoke. "Ah! That's better," sighed Herobrine as he smoothed the magma cream on his scalp. He looked down at Notch, who was sitting patiently. "Notch, would you like a drink? Lava smoothie? With a juice?" Notch smiled and held up a hand. "That's fine, I'm not really thirsty right now," he said politely. Herobrine shrugged and snapped his fingers. A zombie pigman came into the room and held out a tall glass of black and murky with a juice with a little pink umbrella and a bendy straw. Herobrine sucked some of the poisonous gunk and smacked his lips, apparently liking the taste of the toxic liquid. The two rulers began conversation for about 5 minutes, but then Queen Enderdragon arrived. Herobrine pressed a stone button on his throne, which opened up the ceiling. Queen Enderdragon flew down carefully into the large room, cautious not to crush anyone. 6 full-sized magma cubes arranged themselves into a soft platform, which the Queen landed on. She looked at Herobrine with her deep violet eyes and said, "Thank you, Herobrine. I've been having so many Enderman children lately that my muscles are beginning to strain, and these magma cubes are a lot more comfortable than the floor." Herobrine walked up to her and clasped both hands on Queen Enderdragon's claw and shook it. "Is there something my ghast masseurs can do to relieve your muscles? A manicure? Pedicure?" he asked. "No, that won't really help me much. Especially the pedicure. I can't stop moving when I'm getting a treatment. These claws of mine are actually quite ticklish, believe it or not," she replied. Herobrine nodded politely and went back to sitting in his throne. Notch cleared his throat officially and said, "All right then, now that everyone is here, I believe the meeting can begin." Notch stood up and began his speech. "All right. The main reason I decided to host this meeting today was to discuss the matter of that horrid error that is putting bugs in all the hostile mobs. I found that even the wolves of mine are being affected. Once they get angry at you, they'll never stop. Herobrine, is there anything you can do to control your monsters?" Herobrine shook his head angrily as the thought came into his mind. "No, I've tried to get all the Erd mobs to behave, but once they've been taken over by the error, they won't come back into my command. One of my zombie pigmen nearly put a sword through my head, and a ghast blew up an opening in the grand dining room and ate all of the cakes in the kitchen. It's been a disaster, and no matter what I've tried I can't control them," said Herobrine. Notch calmly turned to Queen Enderdragon. "Queen, have you been noticing any problems with your Enderman lately?" The Queen nodded slowly, saying, "Well, recently I've been seeing some groups of Endermen fighting each other. They tried to crumple each other into blocks and pick the victims up, then place them in the void so that they die. And sometimes, when I call back my Enderman for dinner, some of them are picking up the cakes and dropping them down into the void as well. I'm sure it's the same errors that are going on with the other monsters." Notch furrowed his eyebrows together as he thought. After a few seconds, he spoke again. "Well, now we know that the error has something against cakes, but that might be just about it. What I wanted to share was the fact that these Erd mobs are spawning at an unusually quick rate. It's almost as if they're coming from somewhere or someone else. Any ideas? Asked Notch. Herobrine and the Queen looked at each other. It doesn't make sense, though, said Queen Dragon. They can't be coming from anyone besides us, we're the only ones who can spawn them. Notch shrugged his shoulders and said, the Era must have found a way to spawn new mutated mobs by itself and put them in with the normal ones. Or at least that's my theory. Notch continued on with another question. Does anyone have any ideas on how to get rid of the Era? He asked. Herobrine raised his hand quickly. Well, I've seen the mortals on planet Earth do it before. The easiest way they once tried was to put a strong electromagnetic device that would suck the virus out through magnetism, but in the process it also got rid of all the precious data around it. But since the mobs the creature is creating are all mutated with no hopes of being restored, I think it's safe to say we can trap the Era without destroying anything valuable. He suggested. Queen Dragon raised her head to the idea. Ah yes. Brilliant idea, Herobrine. Notch, have you added any blocks with magnetism properties yet? She said as she turned her head to Notch. You know, I haven't really thought about that before. I suppose I could add magnetic blocks and items besides compasses to the world. I think that the next time I'm implementing new updates on the world I will make a magnet and a magnet block. That is a good idea, Queen. Added Notch. Queen Dragon asked a second question that had a deeper meaning than the previous one. If you are going to add magnetism, which resident of the Minecraft world is going to use this new property? Do you have a specific person in mind? She asked. Notch thought about that for a moment, but then nodded as a reply. Well, barely over a half hour ago, two actual humans from the planet Earth, named Norman and Lizzie, in the third dimension traveled through other dimensions and into ours, and this was caused by the Era's work as well. The two are going to find out from Jeff Ironblock of Smelltown about what the Era really is doing, but I know that Jeff barely knows much about it, so I am going to visit him secretly an hour before Norman and Lizzie arrive to tell him everything they need to know. Both Norman and Lizzie have been experiencing the horrible things the Era is doing to their own world, and I have a feeling they are the ones who should know the most about the Era. I'm sorry if I rambled on a bit, sometimes I get a little carried away with my speeches. Apologized Notch. Suddenly, Herobrine jumped in again. Do we know just exactly where the Era even came from? I know that it appeared in the void, but perhaps it came from elsewhere. Another dimension, perhaps? He suggested. You are right, Herobrine, I will look into that right away. We might as well make an educated guess for now. Let's see, the Era is really a mass of mutated viruses and bugs, but where in the overworld could that many come to meet? It can't be here. I have done my very best in trying to minimize the amount of bugs in this dimension. Although, with other people from the planet Earth, third dimension, creating so many mods, it may be possible that those bugs are contributing to the Era's being. Murmured Notch. The Queen added her own inquiry. Well, what will we do if the Era escapes from its prison? We haven't regained the strength we had 400 years ago in that year 2014, and that means we can't seal him away again. She supposed. Notch sighed and lowered his head in with a dreadful feeling in his mind. Well, I will be honest, I am not sure what we will do. When the time comes, we might have to resort to once again visiting the spaces in between dimensions to bring the capsules back up into the dimension. The three rulers sat silently for about 10 seconds, not sure what else to discuss. They had pretty much covered everything. Notch knew this, so he sighed, stood up and said goodbye to his friends. All right, if there are no more items on the agenda, then I believe this meeting is over. I will schedule a time for us to visit the spaces in between dimensions. He nodded at Queen Dragon. The void in the end will be the best area to go to, as it is the easiest to access. Good day, Herobrine and Queen Inda Dragon. After saying his goodbyes, Notch walked back down the long hallway he had entered through, and for some reason there seemed to be no crowds of zombie pigmen anymore. When reaching the portal back to his castle in the ether, Notch stepped through the portal and into the small back room behind his throne. Notch went back out of the room in a hurry, but did not sit back in his throne. Instead, Notch walked up the spiraling staircases in the corner of the throne room, which led high up into space. There was a small room at the top, where Notch spent his time creating new things for the world of Minecraft. Notch put on his work glasses, sat down in a chair near his desk, and began to craft. Chapter 5, Finding Food. The hammer came down with bang. Jeff was working in his blacksmith shop, fixing his recently damaged iron sword. He hadn't even noticed his wife come down into the workshop. Jeff looked up at his wife. He acknowledged the fact that she was pretty for the millionth time in his life, because he loved it when she smiled. Her name was Esmeralda. "Yes, honey?" he asked as Esmeralda entered the room. He stopped banging down on the anvil when he realized that she was carrying their newborn baby, Jonah. He must have been too loud, and immediately felt ashamed. Esmeralda held up a finger to her mouth and said, "Jeff, can you please be a little quieter? Jonah is trying to sleep." Jeff set down his hammer. "Sorry, dear. I'll wait until Jonah is up to do my work," he replied. His wife moved closer and asked, "So how was your battle today? Did you have another successful kill?" Jeff bit his lip and walked up to his wife. He kissed her on the cheek and held her hands, cupping his over hers. "Well, I need to talk to you about that. Remember how I was talking about what the error monster was doing to the hostile mobs?" His wife nodded. "It's been getting worse, and so the battle didn't go so well." He let go of her hand and turned around, putting on a nasty scowl. "That horrible boss of mine Gina Deadbush thinks that we can last the week off of 3 golden ingots, and that's all she gave me. What does she know? She was given the power to summon dead bushes, so I don't understand how she got to be such a businesswoman. Still, I'm sick and tired of her paying me poorly. Being a blacksmith is hard work, and most of the time we don't get many customers because I don't have the money for good enough equipment. Plus, no one wants to buy plain blocks of iron anyway. If I had only gotten a better boss, then maybe my life wouldn't be a living hell. Oh, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do, Esmeralda," he muttered. His wife walked up to him and patted him on the shoulder. "Honey, you're doing just fine. Sure, we might have a difficult week, but you have to look at the positive side of this. You have a wife and a beautiful son, and really in the end gold and diamonds are just materials. Even if we were to die, all of us would have a wonderful life up in the ether with Notch. Jeff, I was named as Esmeralda Wheat, and I could have kept the name comma, which has turned out to be a quite useful power, but I chose to take on your name. This family is an iron block family, so we can toughen out the worst hardships." Jeff looked away from his wife, but knew he couldn't ignore her gaze. "What about our son? Jonah can't go another week with so little food. He's might never be an iron block," exclaimed Jeff. "When children were born from parents of a certain block power, the child would not have that name or that power when born. At the age of 10 they would begin training to become either Vaycrafts or Dungeoneers. If you were given the power of blocks like dirt, wood, brewing stand, or even pumpkin stem, you were chosen to be a Vaycraft. Vaycrafts were the people who would gather resources, build homes, and work in breweries and infirmaries and shops. If you were given the power of blocks like lava, bedrock, diamond, or even air, you were chosen to be a Dungeoneer. Dungeoneers were fighters and warriors who worked to protect the city, the people, and slay any monsters that come near. They also traveled to distant lands to be in wars and battles. Now recently, there had been a third section invented. It was specialized for all the unlucky people who received any of the following blocks: sponge, dragon egg, end portal frame, end portal, nether portal, fern, dead bush, lily pad, cobweb, vines, flower pot, and heads. These people were separated into a group called odd blocks. Odd blocks were the people who were left to do the jobs no one else wanted. This included street cleaner, cobweb exterminator, weapon test subject, mineshaft clearer, etc. As you could imagine, no one ever aimed to become an odd block. Some unlucky fellows didn't even get to be in a category, and for the rest of their lives they mostly struggled to find paying jobs. The people who happened to obtain unimplemented or unused blocks that never made the cut, like dirt slab, gear, lock chest, spike block, crying obsidian, chair, lectern, block 36, and even camera, don't have the best of lives afterwards, so that's just about as bad as you can get. The luckiest, and rarest, category you could get put in was the mob whisperers. A mob whisperer would be born with unexpected powers to tame and speak with any mob, including hostile ones. People who were born as mob whisperers went to special schools for their specific mobs to learn how to control their powers even better. So of course Jeff was worried that his son might end up becoming an odd block or nothing at all when he gained his powers. That last thing he wanted was a son named Jonah Dirt Slab or Jonah Deadbush. But Esmeralda wasn't worried about this. She preferred to stay optimistic, and so tried spreading it to her husband. Jeff, you know that our son is strong. He will make it through the tough times, and he will receive a better power than you think. I promise you he will become a Dungeoneer just like you. He will be Jonah Ironblock. Now then, keep down the noise in here, Jonah still needs to sleep. I'll go and see what we have left for food," said Esmeralda. She left the room with Jonah still in her arms. Jeff stood there, not saying anything. He knew that he was stupid to give up easily, but things seemed hopeless at the moment, and he couldn't get himself to keep hope. So instead, he just stopped thinking about it. He couldn't repair his armor or sword anymore, so instead he just decided to go to bed. He didn't really care what time it was, all he wanted was to forget about everything for a moment. But when he went upstairs to his bed and tried to sleep in it, a message written in white lettering appeared above the bed that read, "You can only sleep at night." So again, he began thinking about the horrible things going on in his life. He'd never stop thinking about it until his life became easier. Jeff then realized that it would be a long rest of the day. So he decided to go into town to see if anyone would be willing to trade for food. He sighed as he walked out the door, because immediately he saw someone walk by chomping down on a juicy steak. Jeff felt his stomach groan at the sight, so he turned in the opposite direction. He thought about who would be willing to trade with him. He only had 3 gold ingots, and there was only one person he knew who would trade with him. That person was Benny Carrot. Benny was an old friend of Jeff's, and gave him fair prices all the time. He was a very elderly farmer who lived around the edge of the town. He owned a small farm where he bred pigs, cows, and chickens. He only had a few animals here and there, but he mainly made his money off of his fabulous carrots. He had been given the block power of carrot, so he made a decent amount of money. Jeff found Benny converting a line of dirt into farmland. Just as he was planting some new carrots, Jeff called out his name to get his attention. "Hey, Benny. How's the farm coming?" Benny looked up and tried to find where the voice had come from. Being 83 years old, Benny had grown blind, so he relied on touch and sound to find his way. Jeff ran up to Benny and put a hand on his shoulder. "Benny, it's me. It's Jeff," said Jeff. A few seconds went by before Benny realized who was talking to him. He smiled and reached out awkwardly in front of him. "Oh. Well, hello Jeffrey. How's the family, eh?" he murmured, His voice weakened with age. Jeff sighed and said honestly, "Not very good at the moment." Benny frowned and began to slowly feel his way back to his small shack next to the farm. "Ah, that's a darn shame," he muttered. Jeff helped Benny into his shack, where Benny walked behind the counter. "All right, what would you like to trade for?" asked Benny. "I'm wondering what I could get for these 3 gold ingots," replied Jeff. Jeff handed Benny the 3 gold ingots, and Benny put them in his inventory. He then hobbled slowly into his back room where all of his chests of products. After a minute or two, Benny came back holding a stack of 20 carrots, a second stack of 10 potatoes, and 1 cooked chicken. Benny handed the items to Jeff, who stared at them in disbelief. "Benny, are you sure you took the right amount? I'm thinking that you may have given me too much," said Jeff, who tried to give back the items. But Benny did not take them back. Instead he smiled and said, "Oh, I've forgotten to tell you something. Lately my brother Gerald Grass, who you know is my main supplier of seeds for growing wheat, has been planning to host a dinner party for his friends and family, and he needs the fattest, juiciest, meatiest pig he can find for the main course. He's planning on making jumbo pork chops with carrot sauce and seeds sprinkled on top, and I'm his only hope. He said that if I can raise a pig big enough for him, he'll pay me a lot of money. So in other words, I need as much gold as possible so that I can make some golden carrots. I found that my golden carrots fatten up the animals very well." Jeff stood there for a moment. Apparently, his 3 measly gold ingots were useful to the old man. He was very thankful, so as Jeff put the food in his inventory he shook Benny's hand vigorously. "Oh, thank you, Benny. My family is beginning to starve, so this really helps a lot," he declared. Benny suddenly gasped and then put on a frown. "What did you say? Your family is beginning to starve? Oh, not poor Esmeralda and little Jonah. Tell you what, how about you take something extra for your family? Once in a while they deserve a treat," he said. Benny opened a chest behind the desk in his little shack and took out something Jeff couldn't see. The old man closed the chest and handed a new item to Jeff. It was a cake. Jeff's mouth dropped open. "But Benny, I don't know. Why?" he finally exclaimed. Benny smiled and felt around for Jeff's hand, and when he found it he shook it. "I've known you since you were in school, and now you have a family of your own. When I was father of 2 boys, we almost never had enough food, and the boys got sick of eating just carrots, and everything having to do with carrots. They both eventually grew up to be strong boys, and now they are Dungeoneers, Louis Fire and Aaron Lava. I don't want your family to go through the same hardships, so you people should be allowed to treat yourself every once in a while. Now go on back to your family and feed them," declared Benny, his hands waving at Jeff. Jeff looked down at the cake in his hands. He knew his wife would be overjoyed, and his son wouldn't be hungry for the whole week. With these positive thoughts in his head, Jeff grinned and rushed out the door, saying a quick goodbye to Benny. Jeff ran right down the streets of town right to the traffic cop. Just kidding, instead he zoomed through the busy streets, down sidewalks, and even over a couple fences. Once reaching his home, he remembered that Jonah might still be sleeping, so he opened the door silently. Esmeralda was in the kitchen, letting Jonah sip from a bucket of fresh milk. She looked up at Jeff and put on a discouraging look. "Jeff, where have you been for the past hour? We've been waiting for you to come back and have lunch with us." "Oh." She suddenly put on a sad expression. "I've taken inventory, and all that's left in our chests are 3 bowls of mushroom stew and 2 steaks. I'm afraid we're going to have to go to the shops and see if anyone will trade with the 3 gold ingots you got." Jeff smiled and said, "Don't worry, I already went out to trade, and I've got us some food. Just look." He gave the 20 carrots, 10 potatoes, 1 cooked chicken, and the cake to Esmeralda, who looked over the load. Her eyes lit up significantly when she saw the cake. "You got a cake? Where in the overworld did you get a cake?" she murmured, staring dreamily at the gooey confectionery. "Old Benny Carrot gave it to me as a treat. Also, he just so happened to be in need of gold, so he took all 3 gold ingots off my hands for the rest of the food. The cake was just an extra he wanted me to have," explained Jeff. That night, Esmeralda made steaming carrot and steak bit soup along with baked potatoes and cake for dessert. Jeff, Esmeralda and Jonah shared one piece of cake, wanting it to last. Jeff couldn't remember the last time he was completely full. Jeff went to bed with a satisfied stomach and a peaceful mind. He was finally at peace now that he knew they wouldn't go hungry anytime soon. He would have had a peaceful sleep if it wasn't for his dream. Chapter 6. The Error's Origin. Despite the fine meal that had soothed his mind and stomach, Jeff had a nightmare. He dreamt that he was in the Ether Palace. He was standing in the main hallway. Jeff looked around, but for some reason the place was completely empty. He couldn't hear anything coming from down the hall, but figured that he should find out where he was. Jeff ran down the giant hallway made of white wool, everything was made of it, and eventually found the end. He skidded to a stop, because the hallway was soon facing wide open sky. Jeff cautiously paused at the edge of the blasted hallway and looked downward. There was a gaping black hole formed in the void far below, and it was consuming everything within sight. Jeff stepped back, not wanting to get caught by the immense force. He turned around to run, but found himself facing something else. It was pitch black, and it crackled with black electricity. It had no specific shape, and was constantly shifting around as though it were made of visible plasma. Jeff didn't want to touch it for he knew it was dangerous and he backed up quickly. Instead, he began moving around the crackling mass of black plasma. Suddenly, he felt an invisible hand grab him and throw him to the ground. Jeff gasped in pain and quickly scrambled backwards. The mass of black plasma shuddered violently, and then let out a horrible screech. Jeff's ears burned with pain, and then he realized that the screech had turned him deaf. The plasma mass moved closer towards Jeff, forcing him to back up. He crawled backwards until he reached the uneven edge of the broken hallway. The black hole was below him, and he had nowhere else to go. He looked back up at the plasma mass. It had gained 2 glowing red slits for eyes, and a gaping red mouth. No teeth were inside, but instead it seemed like the mouth was a black hole in itself. Jeff didn't have time to react before the monster lunged forward and swallowed him whole. Jeff awoke in his bed with a start and found himself soaked in sweat. He was also found himself face to face with a zombie. Jeff jumped out of bed and smacked the zombie in the gut, sending it flying backwards into the wall. He didn't have time to get a weapon, so he smashed the zombie with his fists until it finally died. Jeff stood there, trying to take deep breaths as he calmed himself down. Once he was calm again, he walked over to the window and looked outside. The stars and moon were still in the sky, and he figured he still had about half the night before morning would come. Jeff sighed and walked over to the chest near his bedside. Once he had his fixed iron sword in his hands, he went to bed. He didn't want to be woken up by another zombie unprepared. Meanwhile, Norman and Lizzie were trying to find a place to stay. Every door they knocked on didn't answer, and when they went over to Jeff's house to ask him about the error, no one answered again. As they had knocked hopelessly on the last person's door, Norman sighed and walked outside of the town. Lizzie was disappointed too, because the frigid night was almost unbearable with no place to stay. So instead, they decided to camp out underneath a giant red mushroom. Lizzie would have been bored to death if it wasn't for the mushroom who had wandered over, followed by a mushroom calf. She was desperate for something to do, so she just fooled around with the calf to spare herself of boredom. The mother mushroom had made its way over to Norman, who was curled up in the cold against the giant stem of the mushroom. He learned that night that mushrooms produced an immense amount of body heat, and he used this to make it through the night. By the time the sun had begun to rise up past the horizon, both Norman and Lizzie were fully exhausted, and not to mention hungry. They had counted on having dinner with Jeff Ironblock the night before, but for some reason he wasn't at his own house. They decided to see if he was home so they could still discuss the origin of the error. They made their way back to Jeff's home on Wheatfield Street and Norman stepped up to the door, knocking on it twice. He heard a loud yell of alertness and a thud, and Norman had thoughts of running. But before he could make up his mind, Jeff Ironblock himself had thrown open the door. He was standing there in his boxers, and Norman would have thought this was funny if he hadn't been wearing a deadly look on his face. "What? The sun is barely off the horizon, so why are you knocking on my door?" he grumbled. Norman realized that he might not know it was them, so he explained. "Jeff, it's Norman and Lizzie from the arena. You promised yesterday that you'd talk to us about the error over dinner, but since you weren't home we decided to ask you now." Jeff stood there looking confused for a few seconds, but then he suddenly remembered and slapped a hand over his forehead. "Oh Notch. Sorry. I completely forgot last night. I'll go and get some clothes on, we can talk about this over breakfast," he declared, rushing back into his house. For about 3 minutes Norman heard the sound of rapid footsteps coming from above, and after that time period Jeff came back down in regular clothes. He beckoned them inside, and they sat down in the kitchen at the dinner table. Jeff scowled and sat down in an empty chair. "Ugh. I can't believe I forgot about that. Where did you stay last night?" he murmured, staring at Norman and Lizzie. "We didn't have anywhere to sleep, and we ended up camping out under a giant mushroom outside. It wasn't all that bad, though. A mushroom and her calf appeared around the middle of the night," replied Lizzie. Just then, something came running into the room. It was a tamed wolf. The wolf, dog, came zooming into the kitchen, and tried to jump up onto Lizzie's lap. She laughed and stroked the dog, who started whining lovingly. "And who's this?" she asked. Jeff took a bone out and held it in his hand. "Oh, right. That's Bone Meal, our family dog. Chew, boy." Bone Meal disappeared from the kitchen when Jeff chucked the bone in his hand into an adjacent room. Jeff turned back to Norman and Lizzie. Lizzie seemed a lot more interested in Bone Meal than the error, so she was fidgeting a lot. Norman held out his hands and made a rolling gesture. "So, what is the error?" he asked. Jeff took a deep breath and began to explain. "Well, I had a dream last night about the error, and during it my memory was refreshed about where it had come from. I brought this book down so that you could read about it," he explained, handing a large book to Norman. Norman looked at the front cover. The title was The Ancient Monsters of Minecraft and the cover was completely black on every side, making it look like it was crafted from shadows. When Norman flipped the book open to the first page, a cloud of dust was scattered into the air. Norman coughed for a few seconds, but didn't stop himself from reading. The first page read Chapter 1, Mecha Creeper. Norman flipped through the entire book, looking for something about the error. He passed new chapters that said things like Chapter 2, Tangula or Chapter 3, Zombielk or Chapter 4, Skull and Crossbows. The chapters each contained a horrific-looking monster that represented every different hostile mob, and almost all of them were ones Norman had never seen before. Finally, Norman flipped to the last page of the book. This one read Chapter of Darkness, the Error. Norman suddenly found himself nervous, so he took a calming breath and flipped to the back of the page, which contained one long paragraph. This is what it said. The error's origin. The most fearsome and evil monster of all time is the error. The error is what some could call indescribable, but here we still have its origin. The error was found deep in the world beyond the void when Notch had extended the boundaries of the void 400 years ago. It emerged from the infinite darkness and began to possess everything in the world of Minecraft, causing mayhem and chaos. Its power had been able to access other dimensions outside of the Minecraft dimension as well, and it wreaked havoc wherever it went. The error also created giant mutants from out of the smaller mobs of the Minecraft world, such as the mecha creeper and skull and crossbows. Although it did not create the Wither, who is Herobrine's owned monster, and the Ender Dragon, who had recently become another ruler for the End and not just a monster, it still seemed to become unstoppable. The error and its giant monsters terrorized the Minecraft dimension for a long time, but were finally able to be stopped. The three rulers of the Minecraft world grouped together and formed a powerfully enchanted prison deep inside the void, which they agreed to be the hardest place for the error to escape. The three rulers, Notch, Herobrine, and Queen Ender Dragon, sealed the error and its monsters inside the magic prison to stop it from sucking all dimensions, even the ones outside of the Minecraft dimension, into a never-ending black hole similar to that of the void. Although, the error has been contained for a long time, and it is beginning to grow restless. It is possible that the magic prison will eventually not be able to contain the error any longer, and it may try once again to revive its evil mutant monsters and erase the world of Minecraft. Norman looked up from the book and turned his head to Lizzie, who had been reading over his shoulder. She was actually a slow reader, so she took another minute to finish. She looked down at Norman, then up at Jeff, who was waiting patiently. It says that the prison was beginning to break and that the error may come back and destroy all dimensions. Only it already has come back. Wait, if it's going to swallow all dimensions, does that include our world back on Earth? You know, the third dimension? Asked Lizzie. Jeff took the book back and closed it. I'm afraid that you are correct. The error will have the power to swallow every dimension known to existence and even the unknown ones. I'm assuming that the power used to seal up the error the first time is probably gone from Notch, Herobrine, and Queen Ender Dragon for good. This time the error might just be too powerful. Jeff murmured as he was putting the old book back in a chest nearby. Lizzie's mouth hung open slightly, and her eyes became panicked. Oh. Well, what are we supposed to do? Jeff frowned slightly as he leaned forward on the table. Well, every year when the young Dungeoneers are chosen to become part of the Slayers, who are basically all the Dungeoneers chosen from around this dimension, the armies go in as one big group to try and find where the error's secret stronghold is. Every year they are unsuccessful, and many young ones die in the process. So in other words, I think what you two need to aim for is to get into training school to become Dungeoneers, suggested Jeff. Norman leaned back and let out a breath. He thought about the idea for a few seconds, and then asked Jeff a question. When does training start and end? Jeff bit his lip, and that sent the message to Norman that the answer wouldn't be so good. Well, you start going to training school at the age of 10 and each year the 14-year-olds finish at the summer solstice. So in other words, Norman's mouth hung open. If someone had told him he'd be spending an entire year in an alternate dimension training to go into a war, he would have thought the person had been recently in conversation with Lizzie. He looked close at Jeff, but he showed no sign of leg pulling. Norman put his head in his hands when he realized that he'd be spending a much longer time in Minecraft than he had expected. Plus, they had a lot of catching up to do for the 3 years he and Lizzie missed. Chapter 7, Blockbusting Day. It was the weirdest, but most exciting, year of Norman's life. Both he and Lizzie had still been able to join the schools even though they were 3 years behind, but they had so much more work to do. Lizzie hated homework so much and had quite average grades, but eventually she grew to like her homework, because it was usually something besides a worksheet or an essay. Sometimes it even felt like real school. They had a lot of fun meeting new and equally mischievous people, pulling pranks on the teachers by sneaking silverfish inside of the classroom supplies chests, and replacing the wooden floors in the cafeteria with melons. Yep, Norman had a lot of fun. Or at least for the most part. Considering they were going in so late, they didn't get the best of grades. Norman and Lizzie enjoyed the work, but barely passed by with B's. Norman was disappointed in himself, because in his regular school he got at least A's in every class, with the exception of gym. He thought he would do even better here, but living in the world of Minecraft was so much harder than just controlling the character. Also, Norman learned that many other things changed when living in Minecraft as well. First of all, Norman was surprised how weird it was to punch a tree for wood at first. Here he could just slam it with his fists, make it crack significantly, and then destroy it. Like in the game, when he destroyed a block, its miniature version popped into view, and it flew into his chest when he went near it. His inventory was shown on a cubicle backpack called a block pack that Norman brought with him everywhere. When he zipped it open, there were many squares printed inside where he could insert the stacks of blocks. Whenever he held a tool or a weapon or a piece of armor, it grew to the regular size once it was out of the block pack, and vice versa. And finally, every student that came into the school had to receive surgery. On their non-dominant arm a grid would be inserted into their arm. The little grid planted in their arm would show which 9 items they were holding in the slots, and whatever was in each slot was a 2-dimensional version so that the grid wasn't clunky. That was how everyone showed the hotbar of their inventory, basically. So for Norman, he would forever have a tattoo on his left arm. Norman got used to these strange new habits he was introduced to within the year, and by the time he was 14 it was quite normal. Lizzie seemed to get used to this even faster, and Norman was confused by this, because she never had played an hour of video games in her life. But a year later from when they first found out, they couldn't take the final exams because summer solstice had ended a week before they knew what they had to do, came Blockbusting Day. Blockbusting Day was the final day of the students' training years on the summer solstice where all the ending students took their final exams. There were 4 trials in the final exams. The first one was to test strength, then wits, then flexibility, and finally problem solving. Norman and Lizzie lived in 2 rooms of their own in the training school they attended, Diamond University. Norman woke up early that morning and got ready. Once awake, Norman jumped out of bed and headed to his supplies chest. He couldn't bring anything with him, so he checked his inventory from his block pack and put away everything he still had with him. Bringing supplies was considered cheating for the final exams, and the last thing he needed was to be disqualified. Norman and Lizzie had agreed to meet in the Commons at 5:30 since it started at 6 o'clock. Once Norman had put away his things, he dressed into normal clothing and freshened himself up. He then stepped outside the hallway. He didn't see anyone in the hall except for one of his new friends. His name was Patrick. Patrick was extremely tall and gangly, and was surprisingly witty. Norman caught up with Patrick, who was walking about 5 feet forward in every stride. Norman had to jog to keep the same pace, and Patrick looked down and saw him as he approached. "Oh, hey Norman. You ready for the exams?" "Boy, I sure hope I pass this time," he muttered. Patrick had done so badly at the exams last year that he was actually held back, so he was already 15. Only this time he had grades 3 times better, so he was confident he would finish. Norman nodded to his question and said, "I'm pretty sure I'll pass, just not with flying colors. You know how hard it's been since I was transported here," he murmured, not always comfortable with talking about the topic. He had told Patrick all about what happened back home, and Patrick actually believed him, but he was wise enough not to push too far on the topic. Norman was constantly worrying about his family, and he desperately hoped that the time he was spending here in Minecraft was a lot longer than the time he was missing on Earth. But still, Norman had finally accepted the fact that he was in an alternate dimension, and tried not to think about it. Norman and Patrick walked down the wooden stairs all the way down to the commons where about 114 were waiting, all ready to start the exams. Norman and Patrick instantly found Lizzie standing around the edge of the crowd. When she spotted them, she literally bounced over. She still maintained her fun personality throughout the long year, and stopped in front of them. "So, you guys ready to rock?" she screamed. This act of dorkiness attracted stares from at least half the students in the room. Norman guided Lizzie farther into the crowd so that they weren't in plain sight. Unfortunately, they found Danny standing in their way. He was mean, plain and simple. He was extremely tall and muscular, already had a slight mustache and some stubble, and had a group of 3 cronies following him everywhere. 2 guys named Gabe and Bryce and an obnoxious girl, Alyssa, continuously sucked up to him, and Norman was very annoyed by them. Danny stepped forward towards them, his massive body seeming like it had its own gravity. "Hey there, noobman. I can see your girlfriend is excited for the exams. She looks like she can hardly contain her antics," he announced, his voice booming through the room. A couple of people chuckled, but then the room fell silent. Everyone seemed to be watching them. The last thing Norman wanted was to attract attention, so he tried to walk around Danny. "Sorry, we have to be somewhere," he muttered. Danny stepped in front of him again, enjoying himself greatly. "I'm sure it's not that important. Listen, I know you're confident about the exams, but just don't get too cocky. You have no chance of becoming a Bedrock champion, and everyone knows it." More people laughed this time, and Alyssa laughed in a high-pitched tone. Norman hated it when she did that, because it sounded unnaturally fake. A shudder ran down his spine and he tried walking around Danny again. "Noobman, my entire family has been made of Bedrock champions for 5 generations now, and I'm not going to break that tradition. So in other words..." Danny leaned forward and put himself in Norman's face. Don't even think about taking that title, or... well, you just use your imagination. Got it? Norman just stood there for a few seconds, Danny still staring menacingly at him. He didn't want to walk away now, but he couldn't think of anything clever to say. There was only one thing he could think of. He spread out his forefinger and middle finger and poked Danny in the eyes. Danny had been staring at him a little too close, and was exposed completely. Danny roared in pain and cupped his hands over his eyes, yelling at the top of his lungs. "Argh. I hate you. I'm gonna kill you, noobman. Screw you. Go to the nether and jump in a lava pit, you undeserving piece of crap." He was definitely making quite a scene, and Norman realized he might have prodded him a bit too hard. Through Danny's cupped hands, Norman saw a flash of red. He was bleeding. Norman instantly regretted his actions, and hurried past Danny as he swore in his direction and flipped him off at least 10 times. He hid himself among the crowds, and unfortunately he wasn't able to get back with either Lizzie or Patrick. Danny didn't want to make a fool of himself anymore, and he went to the bathroom to wash off his eyes. About 10 silent minutes went by, everyone was standing around kind of awkwardly after the turn of events, before one of the staff members finally entered the commons. A middle-aged man who looked like your everyday guy, average height with neat brown hair, brown eyes, and shiny white teeth, made his way through the students to the center of the room. He was a mob whisperer, and he could speak with bats. His name, in fact, was Boris Bats. Boris made his way through the crowd until he reached the center of the commons, followed by his pet bat, Carlos. Once Headmaster Boris and Carlos the bat had made it to the center of the room, Boris cleared his throat, which echoed across the now silent commons. Attention all students about to take their final exams, the trials will take place outside in the monster training field so that everyone can fit in to do their testing. If you will, follow me outside, and the tests will begin soon," he announced.